If you want to learn realistic drawings, check out this new technique on the first link of the description. Hello artists, welcome to another tutorial where I show you how to draw something realistic. It seems like you really enjoyed the tutorial on how to draw fur. So let's dive into another realistic drawing tutorial. And today I'm going to show you how to draw a realistic face step by step. I'll start by showing you a drawing with many mistakes, and then I'll show you a more detailed and realistic drawing of a face. And please let me know in the comments what drawing do you want for the next tutorial. So without any further ado, let's get started. I recommend grabbing a notepad as there's quite a bit to cover. And let's begin with the most common mistakes that beginners make when trying to create realistic drawings. It starts with a sketch, and one of the most common mistakes, for example, attempt a section of the drawing before creating the sketch. First of all, you need to make a sketch before you start shading your drawing. That's exactly what I'm doing wrong here. I started without any sketch at all. I started shading right away. And talking about another mistake that beginner artists make is drawing lazily. I know that most of us, when transitioning to realism, are coming from manga, cartoon, or basic drawing style, which are much easier to do. We start drawing in an afternoon and finish in the same afternoon. Or start drawing at night and finish in the same night. At most, it starts in one day and finishes the next. But when it comes to realism, everything is different. We need to set laziness aside and be more detail-oriented, focusing on every millimeter of the drawing, avoiding making lines carelessly without planning. You have to do everything in a very minimalist way, trying to make every centimeter of the drawing realistic. And that takes time. It's time consuming. So the drawing that you use to finish in an afternoon will take a few days now. Sometimes 3 days, or maybe even a week, or perhaps even a month. So if you're lazy when it comes to spending more time drawing, or if you're impatient, it's possible to overcome it. Gradually, you can work on this issue. But if you find that you can't be more patient, maybe realism isn't for you, and that's completely okay. Perhaps you can continue doing another style of art that is faster to complete. But if you want to persist in realism, aiming to create a drawing that looks like a photograph, you can work on your mind. I say this because I'm very impatient and yet I can create realistic drawings, so you can too. I managed to improve and create high quality drawings. With patience, you can achieve that too. Especially if you're using the CR technique for realistic drawings. I demonstrate how this technique works in the link in the description. You can also find it on my Instagram profile or on drawingbooster.com website. Look for it and apply it to your drawings to improve faster. This wrong drawing took me 30 minutes. You will see that the correct drawing would take much more time. I don't think that just by doubling the time, the wrong drawing that took 30 minutes will automatically become good. Because realistic drawings isn't just about spending more time to the sake of it. It requires technique and working on the details correctly. Now let's move on to the next mistake, which is not keeping the pencil tip sharp all the time. To shade the drawing effectively, we need to penetrate the paper's pore, and for that, the pencil needs to be sharp. As you use the pencil and notice that the tip is worn down, you sharpen the pencil again. Now, when it comes to blending the drawing, smudging, and mixing the graphite, it's important to have a piece of tissue paper or a blending stump at hand, and not do as I'm doing with this drawing. If you haven't noticed, I'm blending it with my own finger. What happens is that as we blend, our hand can get sweaty, and we might end up transferring sweat to the drawing paper as we blend with our fingers. Besides, it lacks precision in shaping and defining when using our fingers. So no finger blending, especially because of the issue of transferring sweat to the paper. Whether you want it or not, it won't blend properly. It's not worth the effort. And speaking of something that can potentially mess up your drawing, there's one more thing. If you're right-handed, from the moment you start drawing on the left side of the paper, your hand will be passing over the drawing, which smudges the whole drawing, especially when it comes to graphite drawings like this one. So it's important that you take a piece of regular paper and place it under your hand to prevent smudging. And of course, since I'm not using it in this drawing, the paper is all dirty. By the time I finish, this paper will be much dirtier than that. Another very common issue which happens to 90% of the beginner artists, since we come from art forms that have many lines and outlines, where even focus on having a nice outline, as in manga and cartoon. In this type of drawing called realism, we don't outline. So that very dark line I drew on the jaw, on the chin, and around the nose, and around the mouth, those lines don't exist in realism, and that makes your drawing lose its 3D effects, becomes less realistic. Not darkening the drawing enough is also a problem, but we usually encounter this issue when you're intermediate level. You end up being afraid to darken it and ruin the drawing you've dedicated several hours of your time to, especially when you spend more time creating your pieces. Then you become even more afraid of losing the 3 or 5 or 10 hours you've dedicated to it. That's exactly why people are afraid to darken. So if you find yourself in this situation, try to resolve it because shading is one of the most important elements of a realistic drawing. Along with it comes the contrast between the lighter and darker regions, making shading the key to realism. Speaking of shading and darkening, let's talk a bit about the eyeball. And if you're not sure what the eyeball is, it's what they call the white of the eye. The thing is, because it's white, many people don't shade it, don't create a shading layer in that area. But it's important to do so. If you take a closer look, that area isn't entirely white. It has layers. It's these layers that create the effect of curvature on the surface. So it's important that you create these layers on the white of the eye to avoid it looking unrealistic. Whenever you see these areas of depth of curvature that appears to be white but aren't, dedicate yourself to shading, and the area will instantly become more realistic. When it comes to hair, we never create messy lines like the one I'm making in the video. There's a lot of background paper showing between one line and another. It's a pool feeling, as if the hair has few strands. That's not how you draw hair, especially not at this speed. We always divide the strands first to do a more elaborate job with the individual hair strands. This also applies to fur, not just hair. I posted a video about fur on the channel and I'll leave it below for you to watch. It will help you. Regarding eyebrows, you need to draw hair by hair and avoid basic fillings like the one I'm doing here. And these are the pitfalls of a wrong drawing when it comes to realism. Now let's prepare to move on to the next drawing. On the next one, I'll show you how to do the drawing correctly step by step. And by the end of our tutorial, our drawing will look like this. So now it's time to create the correct drawing, providing you with all the tips to make your drawing realistic. Always keeping in mind the wrong drawing and showing how to do it correctly in this new example. The first point we need to discuss is about the sketch, okay? Unlike what we did in the previous drawing, where there was no sketch and we immediately worked on the facial features like the eyes, mouth, and nose, that will be different here. First, we'll create a well thought out sketch. And what is a well thought out sketch? It's a sketch that not only includes the proportions of the facial features, but also indicates the tonal shading divisions, where it's darker, where it's lighter, and so on. You might be thinking, but Lino, I can hardly see your sketch. And this is another important point. The sketch for realism needs to be very light tones, not interfere with your shading. For this reason, the lines in my sketch are very light in terms of tone, but they're dark enough for me to see them clearly. To help, I use the HB pencil, but you can also use the H pencil because they have a very light tone. Another tip about sketch is I'm doing the sketch here entirely freehand because I practiced this type of sketch for several years. So if you haven't mastered freehand sketch yet and you want to learn realism, I recommend starting with tracing methods. And I like to emphasize there's no shame in using tracing methods. Realistic drawing is a highly challenging level of art. So if someone criticizes you for using tracing methods, simply ignore them and keep using them in your drawings. You will learn realism more quickly that way. Even though I can create freehand sketches quite well, I still sometimes use tracing methods in some drawings. And that doesn't make us any less of an artist than anyone else. Plus, you draw for yourself. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. So use tracing methods more often, especially in the beginning until you learn how to draw realistically. Then you can return to freehand sketching practice. Okay, and after I have completed the sketch fully detailed, I'm going to start shading the eye, the first feature of this face. The first thing I'll do is to put a piece of paper under my hand. Remember that this was one of the mistakes I mentioned in the first drawing? How it can make the drawing look messy if your hand keeps going over the paper. That's exactly why I took a sheet of regular paper and placed it under my hand. This way, I'll always have my hand passing over the regular paper, avoiding any smudging. Another tip is that the pencil tip needs to be sharp at all times for better results and sharper details, like in this case where I'm drawing eyebrow hairs. You can see that it looks very realistic because I did hair by hair and with the sharp tip. The hairs look more refined. Another thing is never to create shades and layers with lines too far apart from each other. Lines closer together make it easier to achieve uniform blend. In the first drawing, I made the lines too far apart from each other with no tone of variation and without care. Quite messy and dirty. But in this drawing here, you need to make it cleaner and more uniform from the start. Because if you do it like this in your drawings, it's easier to move on to the second phase in skin shading, which is blending. And from this part of the eye, I'm smudging with a blending too, as you can see, the blending stump. As I mentioned in the first drawing, no finger blending. Always use a blending stump or a tissue to avoid transferring sweat from your hand to the paper. Next tip, remember when I talked about the eyeball? How it's not entirely white. That's precisely why in this drawing I'm shading to make it darker. You can see how I shaded the right side and I'll shade the left side. When you start shading the eyeballs in your drawings, you will notice how it becomes much more realistic. Another important tip, still talking about the eye, is how you have to blend the iris of the eye and the pupil, if it's visible, of course. In this case of this reference, which is the singer Dua Lipa, she has dark brown eyes, so the pupil doesn't show. The entire iris is quite dark. For this reason, we can use a dark pencil like 6B and fill the iris entirely with a deeper black to achieve a nice contrast. And try to do your best to fill the iris in a beautiful way. I say this because in the first drawing, I didn't dedicate myself enough, and it looks strange, not uniform, with the paper background still showing. Now, for the forehead, the main tip I have for you is to start studying layer construction and gradients. This will help you a lot in building skin layers in larger areas like this. Another important tip you can note for your face drawings is that in larger regions of the drawing, like the forehead, always blend with the tissue, not the blending stump. You can also use a small piece of a toilet paper as I'm using, and I actually prefer it. This helps increase the contact area on the drawing paper, makes the shading more even, and reduces the chances of smudging. For the nose, avoid making those dark lines around the nostrils because it never looks good. The only darker regions on the nose are the nostrils entrances. Those are the two entrances I just created, so always create these darker regions at the nostrils. For the rest, try to work mainly with gradients and subtle layers. Just create volume and depth in the skin. But be careful, otherwise the nose may appear crooked or create the effect of some other deformity in its shape. And unlike what we did with the forehead, where we use a tissue to blend, here we'll use a blending stump because it's a smaller region. So for larger areas, we use tissue, and for smaller ones, we use blending stumps. An important tip that will ensure you'll always have high quality drawings is to go back and correct issues in areas you've already created. As for the case of the eyebrow, the eyesole should be a bit thicker, so I went back and I'm adjusting the eyebrow. Never finish a drawing if you think you could go back and adjust some details. Now for the mouth, there are several important tips. The first one is the contour around the mouth. As I did in the first drawing, you should avoid it. We want outline the lips in this drawing to make it look more realistic and smoother. Another tip is when drawing the teeth. You need to be very careful not to separate the teeth with a darker pencil, otherwise the teeth will look dirty. In fact, teeth are very tricky details to draw. Any mistakes becomes very evident and can ruin your drawing. In the next drawing, when creating the texture on the lip skin, both on top and bottom, try to reproduce the texture in the same way you see in the photo. If you see small lines, various details, try to be faithful to the tone, the angle of the detail, and the shape of the detail. This way, it will look more realistic. No more messy details like in the first drawing. One cool thing and a tip when you're drawing teeth is to try erasing some details and create highlights in the specific points of each tooth, because this will give a wet effect, which looks really nice on the teeth in your mouth drawing. Moving on to the cheek, we'll use the same technique as we did on the forehead, creating gradients and layers in a very even manner. Don't make ugly and poorly executed lines. Always fill lines closely next to each other. When it's time to blend, it's easier to homogenize. When blending, remember that these cheek sections are large, just like the forehead, so use tissue when working on these long sections and blending, such as the cheeks. It's the same as what we do when we are drawing a realistic face. Here's a cool tip for you. Whether you're blending with tissue or blending stump, don't press hard on the paper with the blending stump or tissue. Many people think that to blend graphite, you need to press the blending stump or tissue onto the paper to spread it. But an interesting thing that many people don't know is that graphite is just a powder. So simply lightly pass the blending stump or a tissue over it and it will blend. Patience is important in these movements. So by blending in a low in time, you will see how it will blend all the powder, leaving it smooth. For the next step, avoid drawings that look pale. If you notice, especially with beginner artists, it's common to see drawings that are very light, almost like the character is pale. This happens because of the fear of darkening, as I mentioned in the first drawing. So now, as you can see, I'm creating many dark regions, such as the next section that extends from the back of her hair, which is much darker. If that area is very dark, then I come in and make intensely black to add more contrast and life to the drawing. So don't skimp on the dark pencil, such as the 6B, to create a contrast and shading in your drawing. Regarding hair, there are several tips to consider. First, always keep the pencil tip sharp when simulating hair strands or individual hair. The pencil tip needs to be very sharp for creating realistic hair. Another tip is shading. Just like with skin, we need to add perfect shading to the hair to make it look good. So you create the strands and pay close attention to the spacing between them to prevent the paper bag from showing through. To avoid the paper background showing through, which is a very common problem among beginners, you can use some auxiliary materials like a blending stump or a brush. This way, you create the strands, and in the small spaces between one line and another, you can use the brush. If you don't have a brush, you can, for example, use a lighter pencil to fill in and shade the hair, so the paper background don't show through, as it doesn't look good. Now, let's move on to some advanced tips that take your drawing to the next level. Floating strands. It's common to see stray hairs outside of the main hair strands. I think they call it frizz. My girlfriend is right next to me and she confirmed it. If it's wrong, tell me in the comments. The key is to make these stray hairs very fine, which looks very realistic in the end. Not all strands has the same tonality, somewhat lighter, so you can switch pencils and use 6B pencil for one strand and HB for another, 2B, and so on. The next tip is about adding shine to the hair. After you've created the base layer, you can take an eraser or a kneaded eraser if you have one. Start creating the highlights with an eraser, making the brightest parts. If it becomes too bright, you can then come in with a brush or even a blending stump or a tissue paper and gently go over it to add a great tone effect. After that, create the lighter strands to achieve a nice shine effect in your hair drawing. Now, another common problem that occurs with beginner artists is when drawing the hair roots. Many of them tend to make the strands too thick. If you look at photos of hair, you will see that the hair roots are not very thick. So always try to draw the lines towards the hair roots, lifting the pencil off the paper. You move the pencil in the direction of the hair root and lift it off in the same movement. You would lift the pencil off the paper in a back and forth motion or in a single direction, but always lift it to make both the starting and ending points of the line thin. Another drawing tip, especially for beginners, is to work on the hair strand by strand. I know that when you first look at a head of hair, it might seem overwhelming and you may not know where to start. However, the idea is to divide the hair into strands. By doing this, you can break down the sections you need to work on. You focus on one strand at a time, work on it until it looks realistic, and then you move on to the next. You work step by step, section by section. When you realize it, you'll have completed the entire hair drawing. Now, the most crucial and important tip of all. Remember that I spent only a few minutes creating the first drawing. In this one, I spent a whopping 15 hours, much more time. So if I could give you the most important piece of advice for creating a full portrait drawing, it would be this. You need patience to craft each of the elements in your drawing. I spent a lot of time on each of them, perhaps 2 hours on each eye, 1 hour on the mouth, 1 hour on the nose, 5 hours on the hair, and so on. Realistic drawing takes time. It's not optional. You either do it correctly or it won't look realistic. You need to be patient to create a well-detailed and elaborated, impressive drawing. So this was the time I spent on this drawing. It was all these techniques that I used, different from the first drawing, that allowed me to achieve this different result here. So that's it for today's tutorial. Let me know which drawing you'd like for the next drawing tutorial. I recommend you following me if you want to learn this type of art, and also visit my website to learn the technique I use to create realistic drawings. So that's it. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.